You're listening to the Deepening Your Faith podcast with Daniel Eichelberger, pastor of Providence Baptist Church in McLean, Virginia. Deepening Your Faith exists to help you grow in the grace and knowledge of Jesus Christ for the glory of God and the good of His church. For more about Deepening Your Faith, you can go to pbcmclean.org.
Lenny, what's up, man?
Hey, how's it going?
Good. All right, so you're going to be the first ever guest on the Deepening Your Faith podcast.
Okay.
That may not mean anything, but it means something to me.
Well, always exciting. Always good to talk to you, Daniel, of course.
Yeah.
We've spent an awful lot of years together in ministry, and we care about a lot of the same issues, a lot of theology, philosophy, worldview, and just in general where the church is going. So I think that, it's always an important thing to talk about.
Yeah. I'm trying to remember, when did we meet? How did we meet?
Well, it was obviously at Harvest. It had to be around 2010, probably when they reassigned, because I was under Carmen. The apologetics ministry was under Carmen for a couple of years.
Yeah.
And then I think you came in and took it over, or it was assigned to you as the overseeing pastor, and that's how we got together.
Right. I do remember that, but I feel like we knew each other before that, didn't we?
Well, obviously we had seen each other, but we hadn't partnered together until then.
Right. All right. So you're the founder, president of Come Reason Ministries, right?
Window washer.
Great website. Top 20 apologetics websites, top 16, right?
Podcasts is what
Podcasts. Okay.
Apologetics 315 rated. This is one of the top podcasts. And now there's been a little bit of competition that's added since then, but still.
Sure.
We started back in 1996, and back then the internet was in its infancy. So I was really kind of cutting edge at that point when we started an apologetics website. There just wasn't a whole lot of that happening. I actually precede Bill Craig and by over a decade.
Really?
Yeah.
So he didn't have his own website until
2008.
2008. Wow.
So 96 was the gray page days of the internet. Netscape 2.0. You had to use local dial-up connections, 14.4 modems, and it was really early on. So
okay. Yeah. So you're kind of a pioneer.
Yeah, in that regard, I've been doing it quite some time. That's right.
I mean, if someone wants to know, if they have questions, apologetic type questions, comereason.org is a great website to go to. They can get all kinds of content and answers to their
about 1,000 articles I've written.
1,000 articles.
Yeah. So. And
now you have articles featured in a number of books. What are some of those books, in case people?
Well, I have articles both in a new kind of Apologist that Sean McDowell was the general editor of, talking about new ways of approaching apologetics. Wrote an article in there called "Using Blockbuster Films to Share Your Faith." Also, there was a book that was published called True Reason, Confronting the Irrationality of the New Atheism. This was back when New Atheism was really in its heyday, about 2012, I'm going to say 2013. And I wrote a chapter on the argument from reason, why the fact that human beings can reason proves that it points to the existence of God. And then most popularly, the Apologetic Study Bible for Students, which was put out by Broadman and Holman. And it was one of the top-selling Bibles of all time. I have 3 different articles in there as well.
Really?
Yeah.
Well, that says something, because the Bible itself is a number one seller. So you
That's
were
right.
one seller amongst number one sellers.
Yeah, it was. Well, again, Sean was piloting this, and he did a good job, because what he did was he took the top 150 questions that like kids high school through college would ask. Just and usually these are reflective of society, and he got us to basically address. He had them all listed out. Okay, what do you want to address in here? So I picked 3 that I was going to write up on, and then others that folks that you're familiar with, also contributed. And then we had there's a whole bunch of different issues. Like there's 50 different archaeological finds called Bones and Dirt, where they find out. They talk about the Tel Dan stela or the Nabonidus cylinder and all these things that kind of support the biblical record. There's fast facts to talk about different aspects that you may come up against in your witnessing. And then there's actual points in the scriptures where, like, if you're talking to a Jehovah's Witness and he points to John 1:1, there's an article, there's a little snippet in the bottom that says, here's how they're going to twist that scripture, and here's how you shouldn't take it. So it's a pretty cool little resource. Yeah.
So it's kind of like you've got your Bible with you, but then you also have a bunch of resources built into your Bible to help you answer hard to answer questions that people might throw at you.
Yeah, that's right. And it's a decent study Bible, even in and of itself. It's got a chronology of events, and a lot of people that I talk to say they just really love it. So it's a nice little resource.
And what's the name of that again?
It's the Apologetic Study Bible for Students.
Okay, and that's Broadman and Holdman.
Yeah, Broadman. So through the SBC.
That's right. Little SBC plug there for us. And then, so you and I, we've done some ministry together. You talked about how when I took over the apologetics ministry at Harvest Christian Fellowship in Riverside, California, you were in charge of that. You were the coordinator of the apologetics ministry, and you had this great idea to do these apologetics missions trips that we first partnered with Stand to Reason with. You want to tell everyone about those and what they're about?
Yeah, these are exciting, and I love doing these. They're unique opportunities, because what I found was that most Christians were kind of finding themselves in a holy huddle. And I get that. I understand you want to be set apart from the world, but what happens then is they tend to cloister their children as well. And their children grow up in this isolated environment, never actually hearing objections, never realizing too much about how significant some of these objections may be. Yeah. And then there are folks, after, having them in private school or homeschooling them, send them off to college, where you have a professor who, over the last 20 years, has sharpened and honed his skills in order to basically take down any faith that he deems appropriate to target. And it's like basically having a kid play t-ball and then putting them up against a major league pitcher.
Right.
And this is just a crime. This is something that's awful. So what we do is we gather a group of kids, and we'll take them to a place like UC Berkeley, and we'll go on campus, and we'll send them off in pairs and have them engage students at Berkeley and have them ask questions, and it's all in a controlled environment. And then after a few hours, we all get back together and we debrief, and we say, how did your conversations go? Can you tell me what they said? Can you tell me what objections that they asked, and how did you follow up on that? And then we'll bring in maybe an atheist, and we'll say, you get to give a 20-minute spiel to a group of Christian kids, and the atheist is excited about that. But at the end, we get to ask you questions. We get to drill you. So we did this for Berkeley several times. We did this for Salt Lake City. We would go to Temple Square and engage with Mormons. I even did one time with Dearborn, Michigan, where you have the largest Islamic population, largest mosque in North America is in Dearborn, things of that nature. And what it did was it showed these kids that, those questions are out there. They're not feeling sheltered anymore. They're not going to go to a college and say, hey, What about evolution? Nobody in my Bible study ever talked about this aspect of it. Nobody, maybe they were trying to hide something from me. And secondly, they may not remember all of the answers. But they do know that there are answers out there because they've heard that there's a counter to this, right? The Bible says that one man seems right until he's examined by another.
Right.
And that's the biblical model, that you have to have the back and forth. Without the back and forth, it does seem like that you're trying to, pull a fast one. So that's what these things do. It's great experience, and pretty much you can set them up most anywhere in the country. There's always, if you go to Colorado, you can take kids to Boulder, which is the Berkeley of the Rockies. There are always liberal institutions. There are always different religious areas where you can engage folks. We liked Berkeley and Salt Lake City because Berkeley will cover all of the kind of the philosophical questions. Does God exist? What about the problem of evil? Things like that. You don't get those in Salt Lake City, but Salt Lake City, now it's why is the Bible alone? What about the Trinity? You get kind of theological side of it. So it was a good balance, both sides on that score. And I remember I had a couple of 16-year-old girls go up against some biomed majors in Berkeley. And after about an hour conversation, and by the way, when they engage these atheists, it's not a lot of raucous fighting or shouting. Atheists thank us at the end of the day. They say, hey, I appreciate you asking me these questions, and they were excited to engage. It was a wonderful experience. These two girls come back and go, these guys don't even know where their morality comes from.
Right.
And you could just tell that they were just solid now. They were happy to be in their faith and understand that what they believe is more than simply just what their parents told them.
Yeah, yeah. And what was nice about it is it's all in somewhat of a controlled environment. So if maybe someone had an objection that the students on the trip weren't able to overcome, like you said, we would then debrief, and then the rest of the group would help them to see here's how to handle that next time. And so they'd be reassured rather than just left in the lurches, not knowing the answer. So they faced some of the toughest objections to the Christian faith and learned how to overcome them, and were given the confidence that there are answers to these questions, that our faith is real.
Yeah, and that they could engage in a conversation. They didn't need the quote unquote expert to do it for them. They were like, okay, I get this. And they saw the idea of the fact that you don't have to always defend what you believe. You get to ask other people what they believe in. Well, why is that? What are your reasons for holding the view you hold? And I think that was a big eye opener.
Yeah. You talked about how we had atheists come in and they would give their best argument for atheism and also against Christianity. And one of those atheists that we had come in was Richard Carrier, who you later had a public debate. Where was that? Was that at UC Riverside?
That was at University of California, Riverside. Yeah. And that's actually still up on my YouTube channel, and you can watch the debate there. So that was interesting, because I think it was just a couple of months before the debate. Now, I don't know that he understood or he knew that I was part of that group that he was talking with at the time. But it was pretty interesting to see how that played out. The debate was my first debate, so it was kind of a little nerve-wracking in trying to pull all things.
How many were at the debate?
Oh, there had to have been, there were at least 800 in the hall, and there was a line outside of people waiting to get in. So people are interested in this. The nice thing about debates like this is that you're not just preaching to the choir, so to speak. There's easily as many non-believers as believers, right. And there may be people who are on the fence who attend these things. So you have an opportunity to reach a much larger audience. And we did about an hour's worth of debate and then some Q&A after that. And it was just a pretty big evening all the way around.
Now, I don't think there was anyone who determined who won the debate, but what did you hear around town about?
Well, yeah, I mean, you know how always that goes. People who are atheists say the atheist won the debate, and people who are Christians say the Christians won the debate. So
Right.
we didn't take a poll or anything like that. I know sometimes that they'll do those kinds of things. I do know though that the Sunday following the debate, I was at church and I saw a man, a woman, and their adult son come up to the front of the sanctuary, and they stopped me and they said, are you the man who did the debate last Friday at UCR? And I said, yeah, that was me. Well, my son wanted to talk with you. And he stepped up and he looked and goes, this is my first year in college, and I had really stepped away from my faith. I really just wanted to live my own life, do my own thing. And I went to this debate so that I could arm myself with some ammunition so that my Christian friends would leave me alone. But at the end of the debate, I decided that I think I better come back to church. So for me, that's a win.
Right? Totally. That's all you need. Right?
That's right. That's right.
Better than a poll saying that 75% of people thought you won.
Right. Because it removes it from the intellectual and into the practical, which is
there's fruit from that ministry. That's great. That's cool. I don't know if you had told me that and I forgot, but that's a good story.
Yeah, it's one of those very tangible outworkings. And apologetics is a ministry where many times you don't necessarily know because you're engaging people in some of their most deeply resistant points of their lives. So it can be feel a little thankless from time to time, but every once in a while you find a seed like that. I had another story with a Jehovah's Witness that was kind of in a similar vein. I had a guy, because they come up to me, they'll knock on the door from time to time until they find out who I am, then they blackball the door. But I actually had to chase one guy down because I saw him pull out his card, look at the address, and want to keep walking. Say, hey, I thought you were going door to door. Don't you want to talk?
Yeah.
But this gentleman, it was a Saturday morning. I remember him knocking on the door, and I open it up, and I'm going, wow. And, he has a watchtower in his hands, and I said, first of all, I want to compliment you for taking a step of faith and actually being out here and working on what you believe, because most guys would be watching college football right now. They wouldn't be in a suit and tie going door to door.
The Christians were doing that.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah. So congratulations there. I said, but let me ask you something before we get started. When you go door to door, people must give you a lot of reasons for why they believe the things that they believe, right? He goes, well, what do you mean? I said, well, I mean, you must hear things like, I have to believe that I was born into this. This is why my family raised me. So I have to hold to this faith, or, I'm an American and this is just what we do, or, this is the faith that is most comfortable. This is the one that works for me, or, all of these things. And he goes, oh, I've heard all those. I've heard so many more. You wouldn't believe it. I said, yeah. And I think those are all terrible reasons to believe something. Can we agree that there's only one good reason to believe anything? He goes, well, what's that? I said, well, the only good reason to believe anything is if it's true. I mean, if something's not true, then you shouldn't believe it. And the belief may not necessarily be dangerous, right? Think Santa Claus. A lot of people will tell their children about Santa Claus. And, I don't fault the kids. They've got some empirical evidence. You got cookies are gone, milk's half drunk. You got presents on the floor, right?
Right.
Heard it from an authority figure. You got data you're working with here. But would you want to spend a 5-hour flight next to a 40-year-old man who still believes in Santa Claus? Or would that make you uncomfortable? Would you feel a little nervous about that? Why? Not because it's dangerous, but simply because it's not true. So the only good reason to believe anything is if it's true. And he goes, you're right. And that's why I'm a witness. That's why I hold to the watchtower, right? I said, okay. I go, I know a couple of things about the watchtower. I'm familiar with the International Bible Society and the Watchtower Bible and Tract Organization. And I don't want to talk about blood or birthdays or anything like that. They've made a lot of pronouncements. They've made a lot of pronouncements about Jesus' return, right? They said he was coming back 1878, and then 1914, then 1918, then 1925, then 1970. He goes, well, you got to understand that they're just men and they can get that wrong. He said, okay, I'll give you that. I'm not going to harp on that. But they've also said something else. They've also talked about the divinity of Jesus, whether he was divine or not. Matter of fact, they disavow the historic position that Jesus was God. They hold that he's Michael the Archangel. What if they are wrong on that in the same way that they were wrong about Jesus' return? Would that be something to make you not be a witness anymore? Because, well, they aren't wrong on that. I know that they're, but what if they were? Would you stop being a Jehovah's Witness because they don't understand the deity of Christ? I mean, this is something serious, right? The deity of Christ is something that the witnesses are central about. It's something that historic Christians, Orthodox Christianity is central to. So we've got a big point of contention here. That seems to be a big thing. He goes, well, I don't know. Look, 17 years I've spent as a witness. This is the organization that gives me the most fulfillment, the most order. It is the thing that guides my life. And I said, wait a minute, didn't we just agree that that's a terrible reason to believe something? And he went like this. And he's going, well, you could just see in his mind, it's like he did some kind of word game on me or something. He was really just trying to figure it out. And he felt a little uncomfortable. We talked for a minute or two more. He excused himself and he left. And that was just how I engaged with him. Again, asked some questions, tried to provoke an idea to see whether he's even open to this change, right? And I used that story from time to time to help spur people to go ahead and share their faith. And I was emceeing a Reasons to Believe conference in San Dimas, actually. And we had about 4 minutes to spare, and I gave that story on stage and walked back to my booth. They let the crowd out, and the guy comes up to the booth. He goes, hey, I want to ask you about that story that you told, when, you were talking to the Jehovah's Witnesses. Yeah, about 10 years ago now, but that's a true story. He goes, I know, that was me. And I was floored. He goes, I did not become a Christian then, but it put a question in the back of my mind. And I started the next 2 years searching to try and understand and take this stuff apart.
Very neat.
And it was just flabbergasting. My wife was standing next to me, and she'd heard me tell this tale more than once. And she was going, wow, you never see this kind of thing. So it was an amazing experience.
That kind of reminds me of Greg Koukl. It talks about putting a stone in someone's shoe. You just want to put a little stone in their shoe to make them uncomfortable, make them think. And it seems like you put a stone in their shoe that later on led them to eventually come to faith.
Yeah, one man plants, another man waters, but it's the Spirit that gives the increase, and that's the formula.
Growth. Yeah, that's neat. I wanted to talk about one more thing that you're doing. You have kind of a curriculum that you're putting together, right?
Yeah, this is something interesting. Now, I homeschooled all my kids. You homeschooled your kids. And one of the things that I found lacking in the church in general is that we don't have enough appreciation for the historic foundations of our faith and how robust it has been. Matter of fact, one of the things that I had noticed was, especially as the new atheists were out and about and making all of their objections, I'm going, these aren't new objections. They're just presenting them in a new way. They're just kind of shouting them down and claiming, putting the veneer of science over top of them to dress them up a little bit. But pretty much everything that they're talking about was successfully answered in the 4th century. I mean, it's like we got lots of history behind us. But the problem is we never talk about it. We never talk about it in church. So, for example, if I were to come up to a patriotic American and say, when was the Declaration of Independence signed? Or ask them, what's the Civil War? Or talk to them about, who wrote the Gettysburg Address. They can answer those kinds of questions. Usually as a patriotic American, you have those kinds of answers. But if I were to ask a fervent Christian, can you tell me, when did Luther nail those 95 theses on the Wittenberg door? Or why was the Council of Nicaea called? Or what is the Great Schism? They won't even know what the categories are, let alone what I'm talking about. And that's a shame, because we have to then relearn to answer the same questions that the church has dealt with in prior years over and over again. And so what I thought I would do is I would take a kind of a survey, an overview from the day of Pentecost all the way to the 1500s, to the Reformation. And I broke it into a series of basically 8 lectures that have 2 parts each. So you could be 16 classes, which would be a semester, or you could do it in 8 weeks or 16 weeks, whichever way you like. And we'd combine the history and then the theology, which then leads to practical applications in an apologetics context today. So if we're talking about the Council of Nicaea, we're talking about Arius, we're questioning the issue of whether Jesus was always God, or did he, because he was begotten, does that mean that he was created? Well, that fits really easily into questions of what the Jehovah's Witnesses believe.
Right.
And that was the 300s. I mean, we spent the entire 4th century dealing with these issues. Or if we want to talk about Gnosticism, go even back further to the 2nd century, how the Gnostics held that they were, the real them was a spiritual being, in their body, the material aspect of them was kind of a pseudo representation of them that can be changed or manipulated. And so you want to look at transgenderism, and that
Familiar,
the
right?
same base issues fall in that. And then you've got, of course, the rise of Islam, and the division between Orthodox Christianity and Roman Catholicism, and all of these different things. And so you can pull them all together and really get a pretty good, at least, understanding of just why as Christians, we truly do stand on the shoulders of giants. The famous phrase, if I have seen farther, it's only because I've stood on the shoulders of giants who've come before me. And that is absolutely true. We just don't know it. So I call the thing the uncovering the hidden riches of Christian history, because it's like finding a treasure box, and it really does make you think. And so we're putting it together. We should have the website up within the next couple of months, and then you'd be able to go online and subscribe to them and take the classes at your leisure, or you can use them with your kids. And like I said, you can create a curriculum. It could be a history curriculum. It could be a theology curriculum. It could be a worldview curriculum. You can tailor this to whatever aspect you want. There's a book that you can buy with it that we use, called The Story of Christianity by Justo Gonzalez. There's a final at the end. Again, if you're going to just do this as a small group or for personal study, you don't necessarily have to take the test, but it's all there if you want to do it. And it'll be a kind of a really nice approach, I think, to learning more about this aspect of our faith that's been so neglected.
Right. Very cool. So people can use this in a number of ways. Personal study, they could use it for homeschooling.
Yeah, groups.
When do you expect it to be available?
I'm hoping by May or June is what we're searching for. We were finishing up the editing on the videos now, so I've still got to shoot some intros to them all. But other than that, putting the website together and then getting it out there.
Nice. That's exciting. All right. And then I wanted to talk, you're an apologist, wanted to talk apologetics with you. Years ago when I started seminary, so this early 2000s, everything was about moral relativism. What's true for you may not be true for me. And in many ways, it was a self-defeating argument, right? Like, well,
Right.
is that statement that you just said is true? Well, yes. So at least one thing is absolutely true. There's no such thing as absolute truth. So you could kind of, the claims committed suicide. It feels now like, while there's remnants of that, there's still residual effects of that postmodern belief of moral relativism. It seems like today people believe that things are very true, and they get mad at you if you disagree. And I read a book by Abdu Murray called Saving Truth. And he talks about something called post-truth. We're kind of in a post-truth culture. We've moved from moral relativism to now this post-truth culture. And he says the post-truth mindset acknowledges absolute truth, but subordinates it to preferences. And he says that's dangerous, as logic and evidence don't have the same influence over the post-truth mindset that they had over a postmodern. He says there's two modes to a post-truth mindset. He says the first is what he calls a soft mode, by which I mean that we may acknowledge that truth exists or that certain things are true, but we don't care about the truth if it gets in the way of our personal preferences. And then he says the second mode is hard. He says, by which I mean a willingness to propagate blatant falsehoods, knowing they're false, because doing so serves a higher political or social agenda. So in this post-truth, it's like we know there is such thing as absolute truth, but if that gets in the way of our preferences take precedent over truth. What kind of challenges does that pose to us as Christians today, both apologetically and then just engaging with culture?
Well, yeah, there's a lot there. So first I want to make the distinction between postmodernism and moral relativism, because moral relativism
Exactly the same thing,
is
right?
it is a subset,
Right.
In the fact that somebody could be not necessarily a postmodernist, hold to the idea that there are things that are true, but like a logical positivist, for example, they would argue that scientific aspects or things that are evidentiary are true,
Right.
but things that are moral in nature are simply emotive. It's just, I don't like that, or we don't like that as a society. So there are those who would hold to moral relativism, not discounting all truth. And there's arguments in philosophical circles as to whether we are truly in a postmodern society, or do most people still hold to some ideas of truth. People tend to look both ways before they cross the street, because they don't believe that if they hold to their truth strongly enough, the car will just pass through.
Right. It's not going to go through them.
They don't hold to that. But to your point, and to Abdu's point, when we're talking about moral truths, then yeah, there becomes an aspect to it that you have to understand where the person's coming from. And this is probably the biggest piece where we have to wrestle with as a Christian. We can't assume that the other person would assume that that if we bring up a true statement, that it would always be that way, that it would always apply, let's say, because they would say truth has a contingent component based on our understanding of everything else. And a lot of times they will use mistaken understandings and wiggle room for that. So let's take discrimination. That's just, is it wrong to discriminate? Most people will say, of course it's wrong to discriminate. Well, if you're a discriminating connoisseur, you're discriminating. What discrimination only means is you're trying to pick the best of something.
Right.
Now, it's wrong to discriminate on the basis of factors that are that don't relate to the primary desired goal. So if you want, for example, a good worker, the amount of melanin in their skin
Doesn't matter.
tells you nothing about whether they're a good worker. It's a completely unrelated fact. So making a determination based on that is simply false, but it's never wrong to discriminate wholeheartedly.
Right.
If you're choosing between two good workers and one is clearly better than the other, that's the one you're going to want to choose.
Right.
But we have to start asking the questions as to what matters to you. Now, ultimately, and sometimes people will deny this, sometimes they'll become defensive and try and back out of these kinds of situations. So, for example, when we went to Berkeley once, I had a couple of students with me, and there was a young woman on campus with a sign who she was, I guess, helping a friend of hers running for ASB vice president, and she was doing some campaigning.
Okay.
And we start off, and, the typical questions that we start with at Berkeley is, do you believe in God or a higher power? No, of course not. Nobody at Berkeley believes in God or higher power. Do you believe that there's such a thing as an absolute right and wrong? Right? So no, there's not such a thing as absolute right and wrong. Well, then we engage her, and I say, well, what if there are certain things that are horrible? If that person, believes it, does that still make it right? She goes, I think that right and wrong falls into the understanding of the individual. And if they truly believe it's right, then it's right for them. Okay? But that can affect another person.
Right.
I say, what about rape, for example? What about, we have there's a large indigent population around the park at Berkeley at that time. It's like, some of these individuals are schizophrenic. They hear voices. They get commands from outside, and they truly believe that they must follow those voices. So if one of those people were to come by and grab your sister who's standing next to you and want to rape her, are you saying that that's still right? Because he believes it? And she said, well, I think it may be right for him. Now, her sister looks at her sideways, steps back a little bit, and she goes like, if he truly believes it. And I had to look her in the eye and say, you know what? You're lying to me right now. If this is an actual incident, if this was going on in real life, you would be screaming for the police. Right now, what you're trying to do is you're trying to win an intellectual argument, but that's not reality. So I had to call her on it. And sometimes I think we need to do this. Even when we kind of do this reductio, when we reduce their stance to a notion where it shows that it's absurd, they don't want to give it up because they believe that there's still some wiggle room based on perception. And part of this, I think, is due to the enormous amount of screen time that people engage in today. Because we have an entire generation who understands that you can fake anything on the screen, right? You can project a persona that makes you look so clean and so happy, and you see this all the time, right? It's what I call Pinterest perfect. You have the Christian with the table and the coffee cup and the Bible and the journal with the pen placed just so, and
The lighting.
hashtag blessed, and what happens is you don't see outside the frame that the bed is unmade and the child is with a poopy diaper over here. The only time you see that was that British newscaster who the two kids started trouncing into the room as he was doing the CNN report. Mom was scrambling to try and pull them out of the camera shot. Right. I think that video caught on so much because people just loved the idea that the illusion was broken. But kids know this stuff. They know that anything that happens inside the frame isn't necessarily true. What they do know, though, is I can't doubt my feelings because I feel my feelings. And so their rationale is feelings are the only thing that you can absolutely know it's true because they're first person personal.
Right. They themselves are experiencing.
And what you have to do is you have to try and take them beyond that. Say that's not necessarily true either. Feelings can lie.
Very deceptive, right?
Well, sure. Take any 12-year-old girl who comes home from her junior high class and tells you that she's in love.
Right.
Oh, I love him and he's not paying any attention to me. And what does mom say? No, sweetie, no, you don't. You don't know how I feel. You don't know who I am. Sweetie, I know that this is the most emotion that you've ever felt, but trust me, true love is something way beyond this. This is not what we're talking about yet. It's just you've not had the experience. It can lie to you. It can deceive you. And we have to somehow now navigate that aspect and kind of underscore that for people. So we have to start asking these questions, why is this so important to you? And a lot of times what you'll find is there's an emotional component that's making them kind of react in this way. So it's about unearthing that emotional component. But it's not easy as it used to be to say, well, the good book says, and we're all done. Yeah.
So if I'm understanding you right, what you're saying is the reason why people will choose their preferences over what they know it is true is because their preferences are based in emotions and feelings. And that's what's most real to them in our society.
Not only what's most real, it's what they've been told is the real them. It's what, follow your heart, right? It's the Disney school of theology. It's you can be whatever you want to be. And Carl in his book, Carl Trueman in his book, The Rise and Triumph of the Modern Self, does a very good job of unpacking this idea that we've moved from external reference, the religious man, the economic man, the political man, the Alistair McIntyre's categories, but Trueman teases these out and says, we used to measure ourselves against others in terms of kind of hard stats. You were either a Roman or a barbarian, right? That was the political man. Or you're either faithful or an infidel. That was the religious man. You're either successful or destitute or part of the working class, right? But now it's all about psychological man. I am who I want to create myself to be. And that message has reinforced from the very earliest eras. And parents think that they're doing a service instead of an injustice to their kids by making that a central aspect. You're a girl power, girls can be whatever. And every kind of messaging in our society is bent toward this hyper individualism. And so, of course, that's the yardstick by which we're going to measure everything else. It's part and parcel with our culture.
Yeah. Well, and I mean, I think it's important for us as Christians to be self-examining because we can fall prey into this. I remember back in around 2008 when President Obama had been elected, there was a group email at Harvest. Someone from the church had sent this email to probably 30 to 40 people that I knew. And it was a short clip of President Obama giving a speech. And I can't remember the exact words that he said, but in this clip, he said something along the lines of, in today's age, people can't be trusted to have the freedom that they experience in America. And it sounded very much so like President Obama was anti, freedom, which sounded very anti-American. And so this person who sent the email is like this, he's a horrible person. We need to get him out of office. And I thought, I just can't imagine him saying that, but it was him. It was him saying it. So I found the full video, and what he was actually doing in the speech in context was he was quoting what people from other nations say about America, but it had been edited just so it made it sound like that was his actual belief rather than quoting another belief.
Right.
And the person, to their credit, when I called them out about it, I emailed them. I said, hey, this is taken out of context. We're supposed to be Christians. We're supposed to be promoting the truth, not falsehoods. But I think the mindset was, well, it's about the greater good. Even if he's not guilty here, he's guilty in all these other places, and therefore it's okay. And so you could see where the preference, they did not prefer him to be president, took over or trumped the truth, right? Their
Right.
preferences were more important than the truth. And so in that situation, it was okay to fudge the truth. So, we need to be careful about it as Christians, and we got to be about the truth and promote that, even if it's not what we prefer things to be, right?
Yeah, absolutely. That's and I tell people often, I've even heard, pastors who say if an atheist ever tells you that there's too many contradictions in the Bible, you hand him a Bible and ask him to show you some. And while that may be effective for someone who knows what he's doing, if you haven't studied theology, what are you going to do when he says, okay, how about here and here, and hands it back to you? Bluffing is okay for poker. Bluffing is not okay for witnessing. You should never bluff if you're witnessing, right? You have to tell the truth. Jesus was painfully truthful in his the way he shared his faith and the way he shared the belief system that was necessary. And I think that we have to approach it that same way. We have to be something different than the world. We can't simply adopt the world's techniques for the sake of the greater good, because it just never works out that way.
Yeah. So with all that in mind, what are some maybe tips that you can think of, or maybe that you've used in navigating in this post-truth culture?
Well, a couple of things. First of all, we have to slow down. Matter of fact, I'm talking to a group of junior high and high school students tomorrow, and I'm giving this actual talk where I say, number one, slow down. We sometimes assume too much, and we don't realize that people can legitimately, not out of malice, but legitimately see things differently. Remember the what color is the dress fad that happened over the internet? Some people saw blue and black, some people saw white and gold. And there were these huge arguments about what color was that dress. You probably pop a picture of it on the video when you're doing, right? And it wasn't that these people were lying. It's like that there are legitimate points of view that you don't see it the same way. And so we got to slow down. We got to start and say, before I rush to, well, you're a heathen, let's find out why. I always ask people, why is it that you hold to this view? What is it that you do? What was attractive about this for you? Can you tell me what the most important part of this? Why is it that you believe the things that you believe? Asking questions. That's the second piece in all of this that becomes really important. It's what I call the second grade class photo principle. Now, you remember when we were in elementary school and they would take those dorky class pictures, right? They'd get all the students lined up in 4 rows, and the teacher would stand on each end. And they take the snapshot, and then you get all your individual shots taken. And when they passed the photos back to you 3 weeks later, and you pulled out that class picture, what's the first thing that you did? Who'd you look for?
Yourself.
You always look for yourself. Why? Because you're the stinking most interesting person you know. You are just the most fascinating individual that you can come across. And so by asking them questions, by drilling down, and like I did with the lady at Berkeley, why do you believe that? Because I asked her, I said, well, you say you don't believe in absolute right and wrong, yet you're campaigning for this gentleman. You must believe that his views on these issues are better than his opponent. Otherwise, why would you be campaigning for him? So, well, he helped me move, and so I'm just doing him a favor. I think, okay. She was just really dodging everything. So this is why you continue to ask, really, is doing a favor right? Because he did a favor for you, so you can continue to ask, but ask more questions, make fewer statements. Because what you'll find is most people haven't thought that deeply about even why they hold the beliefs that they hold. Most beliefs are caught rather than taught. They are learned from just the general malaise of the social circle. All my friends are talking about this. Or you've watched a film and the film has taken a specific position morally, and because the protagonist believes that, then I'm going to believe that too, right? Because Star Wars holds to this, then I'm going to be a Jedi Knight, and I'm going to hold to it as well. That kind of subtle manipulation happens quite a bit. But most people, when you then start to ask them about it, all of a sudden they say, wow, that now, I've not thought about it that way. There was an article, matter of fact, just this week in the New York Times. Let me give you an idea. An article about IVF. And there's a company, and this is a live company, who are helping couples who aren't infertile, but they use IVF to pre-select for things like sex, to screen out possible genetic deficiencies. And they're hoping that someday that they can actually even offer things like, well, do you want your child to be a little bit taller than that other child? Do you want him to be a little bit smarter? Things like that. And they're doing this, and the New York Times article was asking the question, is this the future of society? And a gentleman, Pego Gobry, a Frenchman actually, responded, and I thought he was very well spoken in this, where he said, this is just inhuman. And it literally is, because what it will do eventually is it will say that natural procreation is something that we should avoid. We should now start to select for these characteristics. The problem, though, is when you start to select for certain characteristics, you by and large have secondary characteristics or attached characteristics that will be affected. And so you're going to have problems with that. So, for example, imagine all these people who are really, really smart, but they aren't doers. They just think all day. Imagine an entire generation of people who can, ponder, right? And he goes, almost everybody I know who's above 160 in their IQ is terrible at life. They're just terrible at life. They're good about thinking about their one thing, but they can't perform day to day. A lot of them even turn out homeless if they don't have a good wife or something like that. They can't execute. And if everybody is that, then how is society ever going to build anything if you don't have the general working stiff? How are you going to, by eliminating this, you might be actually eliminating something else that's crucial, like creativity in adopting or thinking about things in a different way, as opposed to just thinking deeply about something. And there's all of these, unforeseen consequences that would come out of it. But ultimately, he says, you got to remember, the sexual union is probably one of the highest, in its proper context, it's one of the highest experiences that human beings can have. And you are mostly saying that it's going to be something that we should shun. Oh, can you believe those people, they had their child naturally instead? How cruel are they, because they didn't make sure that their baby didn't have Down syndrome, or they made sure that their baby didn't have Parkinson's susceptibility or something like that. And when you start thinking about this, you can see the virtue signaling. You can see the pressure that it would put on society. You can start to see, and the fact that you're killing, you're fertilizing 16 embryos or something like that and wiping most of them out because they weren't genetically fit enough. Mm-hmm. I mean, how inhuman are we really talking? You're not doing a service to your child by pre-screening them. What you're doing is you're doing a disservice to all of the other children you could have had. But we never think of it that way. And so this is just one issue that you have to talk through. You have to say, well, wait a minute, why do you think that's a good idea? And when they say, well, it helps the baby, and helps the baby how? What about all the other babies? What about, would you look down on someone who had a child naturally? And, man, you're writing Aldous Huxley's Brave New World at that point. It's scary.
In some ways, it kind of reminds me of Babel, where we are, in a sense, wanting to be God, and we want to have the control over everything. We want to control what we want to choose, what sex we are, and now we want to kind of design and create our own babies. And does that make sense? Does it?
Absolutely. I always thought that the line where God says, and now nothing that they propose to do will be withheld from them. I always thought that wasn't necessarily a warning unless I change their language. Nothing. I always thought that was a curse. You want to choose your own way, watch what comes from it. And inevitably, the consequences are always worse. These unforeseen consequences are always going to be more disastrous for us, and it is scary. But it comes back to your original point, right? The snake in the garden said, hath God said?
Did he really
What
say
he's
that?
doing is he's questioning God's truth, and that's all truth is God's truth. If all truth is God's truth, then there is an objective standard outside of you and me, and that's where we can look and appeal to for morality, for issues of reproduction and other things like that. It does also rob us of the imago Dei, doesn't it? It starts to say that there are better people than others. All kinds of issues that come out of this, and it's really a scary thought as we start to turn it over.
Yeah, and you mentioned the image of God, and I in this post-truth culture where, especially when you look at politics, right, where we whatever side of the aisle we find ourselves on, it seems, and when I say we, I mean as an American culture, we tend to vilify the other side, right? And it becomes this us versus them mentality. And I think Christians can fall into this, right? We can fall into team red or team blue. And if we're team red, we vilify team blue and vice versa. And it's so important to remember that we're all created in God's image, and therefore there's a sanctity that God has bestowed upon us that we should honor, and to vilify either side is never justified just because we disagree with their viewpoints. We need to learn how to disagree with someone without vilifying them or hating them or mistreating them. And that's where it seems like our emotions, our preferences take precedence over the truth, right? They're in the image of God, therefore we should respect them and honor them. We can disagree with them. In fact, that's probably honoring them by disagreeing with them if they're wrong.
Yeah.
But we don't mistreat them. And I think, if anything, the church should be leading in that march, right? To modeling that. And maybe that's one of the ways apologetically even we can respond in this post-truth culture, is that we can stand out from the rest of America and not vilify those that we disagree with, but honor them even as we disagree with them.
I completely agree. And it has to be, there has to be a level of respect there, because ultimately the goal is to change the heart by changing the person through conversion. Yeah. And if it's all about me against you, then what you're not doing is you're not sharing Jesus anymore. You're trying to win a fight. And hey, Christ from the cross said, "Lord, forgive them. They know not what they do." I think if that is our model, then that's going to be the model that we have to approach. And this is the problem with what they call the alt-right today. There are certain sub-factions. It's not everybody, but there are certain sub-factions who are making a lot of noise. And again, it's a very small percentage, I believe, overall, who feel that, the ends justify the means, right? It's a pragmatic approach, but Jesus was never simply pragmatic. He had a long game view, because he always had deep respect for each individual. I mean, he even tried to call Judas back, and question him, really, with a kiss? I want you to think about that, but
yeah,
Judas would not. So that's the model. If we are going to be Christ followers, we have to follow him, as you say, even in the times where we don't like it, where we disagree. And even C.S. Lewis said, if I was picking a religion, I certainly wouldn't pick Christianity, because there's a whole lot of difficulty here that I don't like. I would much rather choose a faith that I can do the things that I want. But if Christianity is true, then I have to follow it wherever it leads.
Yep. Yeah. If anything, right, we in an us versus them culture, Christians should step out and be an us for them culture, right? Like we should be giving ourselves up for them. And that's ultimately what Jesus did, right? It took him to the cross, which was him giving himself up for them.
Right.
And we should follow in those footsteps and try and be sacrificial and others centered rather than completely individualistic. I mean, isn't that part of the problem in American culture? We're just so enormously individualistic.
Yeah, that and again the idea that we can't ever admit humility or defeat, or it feels like losing. Oh my goodness.
Yeah. Well, especially in politics, like you're almost not allowed to ever admit fault as a politician, right?
Yeah, and it's gotten worse. I remember back in the day, in the 1980s, where you had Tip O'Neill and the Democratic Congress with Ronald Reagan and a heavy Republican executive branch, right? And they, of course, were very much like the Nancy Pelosi, kind of vibe, where they would sit and they would make these pronouncements, but both of the men said, okay, you go and you talk to your base and you make all the storm and drang and thunder, and I'll go and I'll talk to my base. But then let's get together and we'll see if we can get something done. That was their understanding in the, okay, we'll do it for show. Unfortunately, what's happened is the show is all that's left. Now people actually believe that, and they think that if they ever give up anything, then their constituency is going to call them weak. And part of this, again, has to do with the fact that we live in echo chambers. Social media, especially algorithms, not merely isolate us from the other side, but it shows us the worst aspects of that, right? The most intense, because the algorithm will bring you the things that are getting the most comments, which are usually the most vitriolic or the most outrageous statements or things like that. Those are the ones that everybody's talking about. So those are the ones that show up on your feed. And most people, what happens is because they have left the public square and they've gone to the digital square, that's all they hear. And so they say, well, everybody's talking about this. And it's just not true. That's not what everybody's beliefs are. This is a very, very small faction of people online, but it gives the illusion that everybody's talking about it because it's the only thing that you see. So the algorithms and the social media actually have a feedback loop component to it, and it makes the whole thing worse.
It's no wonder in this day and age, people don't know what the truth is, right?
Right. Exactly.
It's that much harder to discern it now. Well, we're about an hour or so here on the mark. Any closing thoughts that you wanted to share before we wrap up?
No, I think this is going to be a great podcast. I hope people will come out and listen to it. I'm sure you're going to have a lot of interesting guests and engaging in certain interesting topics. So I'm excited to see that. And I just hope that people will, again, make sure that they understand what the culture is out there and how they can be different as a Christian, because that's the key component. Let me go back to, for example, Tertullian, who wrote a letter to the emperor during one of the persecutions. And one of the things that he did while he was trying to defend Christians, he goes, look, emperor, that these charges against us as being immoral are false. In fact, you know it so well that you would rather take our women and put them into brothels rather than put them in the lion's den, because we don't fear death as much as we fear falling into immorality. And so your very actions prove that you understand that we are the most moral citizens you have in the empire. Now, Tertullian makes that argument. That's a fascinating argument. He's saying by your actions, you're proving or you're contradicting the very claims that you say we're guilty of. And again, people don't know this. They've never heard of these church fathers. They've never read this stuff. Tertullian's also in that same letter. He's the one that says, slay us. The church of the blood of the church is seed and will grow up stronger than before, right? It's that very famous line in his Apology. So when you think about that, that's the Christian you need to be. You need to be the most moral, the most upright, the one who, through his actions, shows defiance to the corruption of the day, to where you can't be accused of any wrongdoing because it just makes no sense. And I think that's a good lesson for us to walk away with.
Yeah, well said. All right, so your website, comereason.org.
Comereason.org. Yep, you probably put it down in the description as well. And from there, you'll be able to, you can sign up for the newsletter. Like I said, within a month or so, we'll have an announcement on the curriculum coming out, and then you can just follow me on any social media channel. It's anything/Come Reason. So Instagram, YouTube.
You've got Come Reason cornered.
TikTok, everything/Come Reason. You'll find me. That's where it goes.
And then Apologetic Study Bible for Students.
Yeah, and I do have that on the website, but you can also find it on Amazon and other places as well.
And then the name of your curriculum that's going to that will be out in May or June. One more time.
It's Uncovering the Hidden Riches of Christian History.
Very good. Well, I look forward to that. I know everything you do is excellent, and appreciate your ministry, appreciate your friendship, and appreciate the time that you gave today.
All right. Thanks so much.
All right, brother.